Welcome back to Bio Bytes, where we dive deep into the lives of history's most complex and infamous figures. Today, we're exploring a man whose legacy is shrouded in tragedy and terror. Known to the world as Pol Pot, his rule over Cambodia left behind one of the darkest chapters in modern history. But how did a boy from a small Cambodian village transform into a dictator, presiding over a reign of horror? How did he rise to power, and what fueled his ruthless vision? Join us as we trace the journey of Pol Pot, a journey that led him from a quiet life in rural Cambodia to a leadership that saw nearly a quarter of the population perish. Born as Saloth Sar, the man who would become Pol Pot entered the world on May 25, 1928. His birthplace was Prek Spauv, a quiet village in northeastern Cambodia, far from the bustling cities. Prek Spauv sat along the Sen River, surrounded by green rice paddies and dense forests, a place where life moved at the steady pace of nature and tradition. His family's roots were modest, but relatively privileged for the time. Saloth Fem, his father, was a respected farmer, owning over 20 acres of rice paddies, a significant amount in a country where many struggled just to get by. His mother, Sok Nem, was known for her deep piety and devotion to Buddhism, a faith that underpinned nearly every part of life in Cambodia. Saloth Sar grew up with these values around him, attending Buddhist ceremonies and learning the virtues of humility, respect, and balance, ideals that seemed to guide him outwardly, even as he veered far from them later in life. As the family's wealth afforded Saloth Sar a rare opportunity for education, his life began to change in ways his small village could hardly imagine. At a young age, he left the familiarity of Prek Spauv and journeyed to Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital city. It was here, in the bustling heart of Cambodia, that he was introduced to new ideas, new cultures, and a very different world. He enrolled in the prestigious École Miche, a Catholic school that introduced him to French language and culture. Here, he learned not only French history and literature, but also ideals rooted in European philosophy, freedom, equality, fraternity. But it was a strange irony. The very system that taught these principles also denied these freedoms to Cambodia, a nation under French colonial rule. And young Saloth Sar, though outwardly compliant, began to see the world with a growing sense of contradiction. These early years in Phnom Penh planted the seeds of a deep and lasting resentment toward the ruling class and foreign influence. He saw his homeland's own customs and traditions pushed aside, replaced by the structures and demands of a colonial power. In time, these experiences would blend with other revolutionary ideas, shaping a vision of change, a vision that, later in life, would morph into something far darker. For now, Saloth Sar, like many young Cambodians, was still exploring his identity, still finding his place. But even as he walked the halls of his Catholic school, far from the rice paddies and simple life he knew, he carried with him a sense of who he was, and the deep-seated desire to reclaim what he saw as Cambodia's true spirit. This sense of self, pride, and heritage would stay with him and grow over time, twisting into a radicalism that few could have foreseen. Leaving the familiar life in Phnom Penh, young Saloth Sar embarked on a journey that would take him to the heart of Europe. In 1949, he was awarded a scholarship to study in Paris, an extraordinary opportunity for a Cambodian student at the time. But his time in Paris would become a turning point, a place where the young man from Prek Spauv would be introduced to ideas, ambitions, and ideologies that would transform him forever. Paris, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, was a hub of intellectual fervor, alive with political and philosophical debates that spilled over into cafes and universities. As Europe reeled from the devastation of the Second World War, students and intellectuals gathered in search of new political pathways, new visions of society that promised fairness, justice, and an end to oppression. Saloth Sar, who was studying radio engineering, was swept into these currents, finding himself drawn to the revolutionary spirit of the era. It was here, in Paris, that he first encountered the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. Their ideas were radical, calling for a complete transformation of society, a dismantling of old structures, and a redistribution of power. These writings ignited something within Saloth Sar, a sense that change was not only possible but necessary. The principles of Marxism and Leninism spoke to him, not just in theory, but as a roadmap to revolution. a guide for how Cambodia could cast off the weight of colonialism and create a society that was free from foreign dominance and class oppression. But these ideas were just the beginning. In Paris, Saloth Sar became part of a tight-knit group of Cambodian students who shared his frustrations with French colonial rule. Together, they gathered, debated, and dreamed of an independent Cambodia, free from both foreign rule and the traditional elite. They formed study groups, discussed the writings of revolutionary thinkers, and began laying the foundation for a radical movement. Among them were men like Ieng Sari and Khieu Samphan, who would one day become his closest allies and co-leaders in a new and brutal regime. At first, their meetings were about Cambodian independence, a common goal shared by many colonized nations. But as these young intellectuals delved deeper into Marxist-Leninist ideology, their vision grew more radical, more uncompromising. They didn't just want to end colonial rule, they wanted a complete overhaul of society itself. Influenced by the writings of Mao Zedong and the communist victory in China, they began to imagine a Cambodia where the old structures of power would be erased, replaced by a new order in which the working class would hold control. In their minds, this was the only way to create a Cambodia free from oppression. Saloth Sar's time in Paris also coincided with a wave of anti-colonial movements sweeping across the world. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, oppressed peoples were rising up, demanding their freedom. Vietnam, which bordered his own country, was in the throes of its own anti-colonial struggle, as Ho Chi Minh led the fight against the French in what would become the First Indochina War. Inspired by these global uprisings, Saloth Sar's dreams for Cambodia began to harden into something more intense, more militant. By the time he returned to Cambodia in 1953, Saloth Sar was no longer the same young man who had left for Paris. His worldview had shifted dramatically. He returned with a deep-seated hatred of colonial powers, a sense of mission, and a belief that only through radical, violent transformation could Cambodia find true independence and equality. The seeds of his future vision were planted, a vision that would ultimately drive him to create a society stripped of all its traditional structures. Now, as he re-entered his homeland, he was no longer simply Saloth Sar, the former student. He was a revolutionary in the making, a man who believed that only through the most extreme measures could he free Cambodia from both colonial influence and what he saw as the oppressive weight of the past. And it was this belief, this unwavering conviction, that would lead him down a path of terror, a path that would leave Cambodia scarred and grieving for generations to come. Upon his return to Cambodia in 1953, Saloth Sar, the young man who would become Pol Pot, found a nation teetering on the edge of change. The last echoes of World War II had set off a wave of decolonization across Asia, and like many other nations, Cambodia was experiencing a strong desire to break free from its colonial rulers. After years in France, exposed to Marxist-Leninist ideology and inspired by other revolutionary movements, Saloth Sar returned with more than just a degree. He carried within him a radical vision for his homeland. Initially, however, he kept his intentions guarded. Saloth Sar's first move was to immerse himself quietly into Cambodian society. He took up work as a teacher, instructing students in geography, history, and literature. His teaching career was a front that allowed him to reconnect with his homeland while assessing the political climate. But he never abandoned the revolutionary ideals he had fostered in Paris. Instead, he began covertly sharing his vision with trusted associates, speaking of a new Cambodia free from class oppression and foreign influence. In the years immediately following his return, Cambodia's political landscape was as turbulent as the broader Southeast Asian region. King Norodom Sihanouk had just achieved a monumental feat. He secured independence for Cambodia from France in November 1953. Yet this new independence came with complexities. Sihanouk, who had abdicated his throne to focus on the role of prime minister, maintained a strong hand in Cambodian politics. He set up his own political party, Sangkum, which promoted a blend of conservatism and socialism that he believed could unify the country. The king held tight control over his regime, and Cambodia became a one-party state, with Sangkum as its ruling political machine. But beneath the surface of this seemingly stable regime, a current of dissatisfaction was building. Despite the independence from France, many Cambodians, especially those who had been influenced by radical ideas abroad, saw Sihanouk as another form of authoritarian ruler who preserved the old structures of power. Landowners, elite families, and officials loyal to the monarchy continued to dominate, and for people like Saloth Sar, this felt like a betrayal of Cambodia's potential for true revolution. It was within this context that Saloth Sar, along with a few like-minded individuals, decided to act. In 1960, they founded the Communist Party of Kampuchea, a clandestine organization dedicated to the overthrow of Sihanouk's government and the establishment of a new socialist state. This small group of radicals, Saloth Sar among them, dreamed of a Cambodia that was not just independent, but fundamentally restructured. They imagined a nation where the rural poor would take the place of the elites, where traditional society would be dismantled, and where every aspect of Cambodian life would be controlled under a singular, rigid ideology. Operating in secrecy, the Communist Party of Kampuchea attracted a tight-knit circle of followers, many of whom were young, idealistic, and inspired by the growing tide of communist revolutions across Asia. Saloth Sar, who was gaining influence among this core group, began organizing cells of supporters across the country, particularly in the countryside where he saw the greatest potential for a peasant-led revolution. In many ways, these were the formative years for Saloth Sar's transformation into the leader who would later be known as Pol Pot. Yet, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, which would later become synonymous with the Khmer Rouge, was still a small force in the early 1960s. King Sihanouk's government, though authoritarian, was widely supported. His Sangkum party dominated the political sphere, and his promise of Buddhist socialism seemed to appeal to the traditional values of the Cambodian people. Sihanouk was popular, charismatic, and wielded immense power over his people, making any direct opposition nearly impossible. But the Communist Party of Kampuchea continued to grow in the shadows, quietly planting the seeds of rebellion. The group held secret meetings, developed propaganda to be distributed in rural areas, and began training their members in guerrilla tactics. Saloth Sar, now increasingly taking on the pseudonym Pol Pot, was rising as a leader within this underground movement, recognized for his reserved yet unyielding nature, his vision for an agrarian socialist society, and his determination to challenge Sihanouk's rule. As the 1960s unfolded, Cambodia's geopolitical situation became more complex, and the political tensions within the country intensified. To Cambodia's east, Vietnam was engulfed in its own brutal conflict, with North Vietnamese communist forces gaining ground in their struggle against South Vietnam and its U.S. allies. This proximity to the Vietnam War had profound consequences for Cambodia. The North Vietnamese saw Cambodia as a vital region for logistical support, using Cambodian jungles to build bases and supply lines for their southern offensive. This drew Cambodia into the broader Cold War struggles in Southeast Asia, placing it on a collision course with global superpowers. For Pol Pot and the Communist Party of Kampuchea, this shift presented both challenges and opportunities. While Sihanouk's government attempted to maintain a delicate neutrality, Pol Pot saw the growing regional conflict as an opening. He understood that, in the chaos of the Vietnam War, his revolutionary movement could leverage support from the North Vietnamese communists. Thus, even as they opposed Sihanouk, Pol Pot's forces forged a strategic, albeit cautious, alliance with the Vietnamese communists, who could provide training and resources that would be crucial in the coming years. The rise of Pol Pot's influence and the escalation of his revolutionary activities signaled a shift in the Cambodian communist movement's strategy. They were no longer a minor, underground faction. They had begun to amass power, resources, and alliances that would position them to challenge Sihanouk's government directly. Yet, Pol Pot and his followers knew that an open conflict with the popular Sihanouk would be perilous. However, their patience would soon be rewarded by a sudden turn of events in Cambodian politics. In 1970, a coup d'état overthrew Sihanouk, ousting the former king and driving him into exile. Cambodia's political landscape, once so tightly controlled, had erupted into chaos. A pro-American government, led by Prime Minister Lon Nol, now took control, severing ties with North Vietnam and drawing Cambodia even further into the Vietnam War's orbit. This unexpected upheaval opened the door for Pol Pot and the Communist Party of Kampuchea. With Sihanouk in exile and Cambodia's leadership fractured, Pol Pot's movement would soon seize the opportunity to step out from the shadows and mobilize its forces in a bid for absolute power. The quiet teacher, the secret revolutionary, the man known as Saloth Sar, he was now poised to begin his ascent as one of history's most infamous dictators, leading a movement that would plunge Cambodia into an era of profound suffering and unimaginable cruelty. As the 1970s dawned, Cambodia found itself at a pivotal crossroads. In neighboring Vietnam, the war between the communist North and the American-backed South raged with no end in sight. And in Cambodia, a sudden political shakeup changed everything. The pro-American general, Lon Nol, overthrew Prince Norodom Sihanouk in a coup in March 1970. In an instant, Cambodia, which had long attempted to remain neutral, was thrust violently into the heart of Cold War conflicts. Lon Nol's new government turned decisively against the communist forces operating in Cambodia, including the North Vietnamese and their allies, and threw its weight behind U.S. interests in the region. For Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, the chaos unleashed by the coup was a golden opportunity. While Pol Pot's movement had operated as a fringe element in Cambodian politics for years, always on the fringes, they had learned the art of patience and organization. The Khmer Rouge now positioned themselves as Cambodia's most ardent anti-imperialists, determined to drive out both the Americans and the new puppet government they had left in charge. It was at this moment that Sihanouk, now living in exile, made a surprising move. He reached out to the Khmer Rouge. For years, he had been their enemy, the leader of a government they sought to overthrow. But now, stripped of his power, Sihanouk allied himself with the Khmer Rouge, lending his name and influence to a movement that promised to fight against Lon Nol and restore him to power. This alliance brought an unexpected wave of support for the Khmer Rouge, as many Cambodians loyal to Sihanouk, especially those in rural areas, now viewed the Khmer Rouge as legitimate freedom fighters. With popular support swelling, the Khmer Rouge began to expand and solidify its organization. Pol Pot and his closest allies, including Nuon Chea and Yang Sari, developed a command structure and a ruthless discipline among their followers. The Khmer Rouge's core was divided into smaller units, each fiercely loyal to Pol Pot and prepared to carry out his orders without question. And in the rural areas, where Lon Nol's control was weakest, the Khmer Rouge began implementing their revolutionary policies, seizing land from local elites, and beginning the collectivization that would later characterize their rule. The Khmer Rouge's rise also depended heavily on their ability to wage effective guerrilla warfare. They knew they could not defeat Lon Nol's forces in traditional battles. Instead, they used the rugged jungle terrain to their advantage, staging hit-and-run attacks and vanishing before the government forces could respond. These tactics, combined with a deep knowledge of the Cambodian landscape and a network of local sympathizers, gave them the upper hand in many regions, especially as government forces stretched themselves thin trying to maintain control over both cities and rural areas. In addition to these guerrilla tactics, the Khmer Rouge received crucial assistance from North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese forces, fighting their own battle against South Vietnam and its American backers, viewed the Khmer Rouge as a useful ally, supplying them with weapons, training, and logistical support. In return, the Khmer Rouge allowed North Vietnamese forces to establish bases in Cambodian territory, using the remote jungles to support their war effort in Vietnam. The United States, now fully aware of the importance of Cambodia as a support base for the North Vietnamese, responded by launching a series of bombing campaigns. Between 1969 and 1973, American B-52 bombers unleashed over 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, targeting areas believed to be North Vietnamese strongholds. The scale of the bombing was staggering, and its impact on the Cambodian people was devastating. Villages were leveled, farms were destroyed, and countless civilians were killed. The intense bombing campaign turned vast swaths of Cambodia into rubble, further alienating the rural population from the pro-American government in Phnom Penh. This U.S. involvement, intended to weaken the North Vietnamese and their allies, had the opposite effect on Cambodian politics. Rather than undermining the Khmer Rouge, it strengthened their appeal among ordinary Cambodians. Pol Pot and his followers seized on the devastation caused by the bombings as evidence of Lon Nol's betrayal, and painted the Khmer Rouge as the only force capable of resisting foreign intervention. Across the countryside, villagers began to see the Khmer Rouge as their only hope for a future free from foreign influence. As the civil war intensified, Pol Pot's influence within the Khmer Rouge continued to grow. His reserved, enigmatic nature had always given him an air of mystery, but within the movement, he was seen as a steady and uncompromising leader. While other leaders came and went, Pol Pot remained a constant presence, guiding the Khmer Rouge with a singular vision. Over time, his authority within the movement became absolute. He was now not just a figurehead, but the undisputed leader, directing both the ideological course of the Khmer Rouge and its military strategy. Under Pol Pot's leadership, the Khmer Rouge became more than just a guerrilla force. They evolved into a disciplined army, ready to seize control of the entire country. His rise was not just due to his political savvy. It was also due to his ruthlessness. Pol Pot ensured that any dissent within the ranks was dealt with swiftly and brutally. Those who questioned his decisions or posed a threat to his power were often executed, their deaths a reminder to others of the absolute loyalty he demanded. Through this calculated mix of ideological vision, strategic alliances, and brutal discipline, Pol Pot transformed the Khmer Rouge into a formidable force. By the early 1970s, the Khmer Rouge controlled much of Cambodia's countryside, while Lon Nol's government was increasingly confined to the cities. The Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh, had become a symbol of government control, but outside its borders the Khmer Rouge were gaining ground every day. In rural areas, they began imposing their radical vision of society, taking land from landlords, forcing peasants into collective farms, and executing those they deemed enemies of the revolution. In 1975, as the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, Lon Nol's government lost its last major supporter. Isolated, weakened, and surrounded, the government in Phnom Penh could no longer hold off the Khmer Rouge. The final assault on the capital began in April 1975, and within days, Phnom Penh fell. The Khmer Rouge marched triumphantly into the city, greeted by a mixture of fear and hope from the Cambodian people. For many, this was the end of foreign interference, the dawn of a new era. But for Pol Pot, this victory was just the beginning. He had achieved the first phase of his vision, toppling the old government and seizing control of Cambodia. Now, he was free to implement his radical ideology across the entire nation. Pol Pot's rise was complete, and the Khmer Rouge, once a fringe movement operating in the shadows, was now the government of Cambodia. In the coming years, Pol Pot's vision would reshape the country in unimaginable ways, turning Cambodia into a vast social experiment that would leave millions dead and forever alter the course of its history. As Pol Pot prepared to enact his revolutionary vision, the world was unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. The quiet revolutionary had become an absolute ruler, and with his new power, he would set Cambodia on a path that would forever mark his name in history. In April 1975, after years of bloody conflict, the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh, marking a decisive moment in Cambodian history. The victorious soldiers, led by Pol Pot, took the capital with a mix of silence and intimidation, their presence ominous to those left in the city. For Phnom Penh's residents, the end of the civil war was bittersweet. Many were hopeful, yet unaware that their lives were about to be shattered. Within hours of their victory, the Khmer Rouge issued an order that would forever change Cambodia's social landscape. Over loudspeakers, they instructed everyone to leave the city. At first, people thought it was a temporary evacuation, just a matter of days. They were told the Americans would bomb the capital and that it was for their safety. Many walked out with only a few belongings, not realizing they'd never return to their homes, their neighborhoods, or the lives they'd known. The forced evacuation was staggering in scale. Hospitals emptied, schools closed, businesses shut down, and entire families were driven out of the city in endless lines that stretched into the horizon. People of every class and occupation, teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, monks, were forced to abandon their urban lives and head into the rural countryside, where Pol Pot's vision for Cambodia awaited them. For Pol Pot, Phnom Penh and all urban centers symbolized decay and corruption, a form of Western-influenced society that he saw as harmful to Cambodia's soul. Pol Pot's ideology, The foundation of this brutal restructuring was built on an extreme vision of agrarian socialism. He had spent years formulating a plan to take Cambodia back to a year zero, erasing any influence of foreign or urban culture. Inspired partly by Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, he believed in a self-sufficient society rooted in peasant agriculture. In Pol Pot's eyes, cities, technology, and educated citizens represented unnecessary complexity, and by extension, corruption. His dream was a nation of farmers, uneducated, unquestioning, and unwaveringly loyal to the state. Once the people reached the countryside, they encountered a world governed by a new, twisted logic. The Khmer Rouge's slogan, "To keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss," hung heavy over the fields. This phrase was not just rhetoric, it was a chilling summary of the regime's view on human life. Under Pol Pot's rule, citizens became mere instruments of labor, valued only for what they could produce. In pursuit of his agrarian ideal, Pol Pot ordered the systematic dismantling of Cambodian society. Social class, family bonds, and religion were viewed as threats to his vision. Class structures were to be eliminated entirely, with all Cambodians considered equal under this new regime. In theory, it was a radical quest for equality, but in practice, it was a method for stripping away individuality, dissent, and loyalty to anything other than the state. The Khmer Rouge established cooperatives where people were assigned grueling labor tasks and forced to toil under extreme conditions with barely enough food to survive. Personal possessions were confiscated. Even traditional family ties were dissolved, with parents and children often separated. Education was dismantled, with schools closed, books destroyed, and teachers either executed or put to work in the fields. Religion, especially Buddhism, was banned, as were traditional practices and holidays. Temples were desecrated or repurposed, and monks were either killed or forced into labor, erasing centuries of cultural and spiritual heritage in a matter of months. Pol Pot aimed to create a society free from history, individuality, and cultural memory. And yet there was another layer to this vision of radical equality, a brutal system that treated anyone deemed intellectual or privileged as enemies. Simply wearing glasses, speaking a foreign language, or possessing a high school education was grounds for suspicion. Doctors, engineers, professors, artists, and government officials were among the first to be executed, often taken to remote fields where they were brutally killed in what would come to be known as the killing fields. In this new regime, knowledge and education became liabilities, symbols of the old society that Pol Pot was determined to obliterate. Within the first few years of Khmer Rouge rule, hundreds of thousands had perished. Starvation, forced labor, disease, and outright execution claimed lives on an unimaginable scale. The forced evacuation of Phnom Penh and the establishment of democratic Kampuchea had achieved what Pol Pot had desired: the complete transformation of Cambodia into a nation devoid of its past, living in the dark shadow of his vision for an agrarian utopia. Yet this utopia was built on suffering, repression, and loss, an entire society forced into obedience, with little hope and no escape. In the years to come, Cambodia would be left to reckon with the devastation of Pol Pot's reign, but by the time his regime began to falter, the damage had already been done. Life under the Khmer Rouge was unlike anything Cambodia had ever experienced. From the moment Pol Pot seized control, he began to implement policies that would transform the nation into his vision of an agrarian utopia, a vision that rested on extreme collectivization, forced labor, and the complete erasure of Cambodian culture, economy, and identity. This transformation began with a single idea: Year Zero. The concept of Year Zero was a brutal metaphor for the Khmer Rouge's intent. For Pol Pot and his followers, the nation's past was considered corrupt and irrelevant. History, tradition, education, and culture, everything that had come before, was to be wiped away to make room for a new Cambodia. The year 1975 marked the beginning of this new calendar, a rebirth achieved by violent purges and repression. Pol Pot's first decree was to strip Cambodia of its social and economic systems. The Khmer Rouge dismantled all private property and declared an end to currency, market exchange, and individual ownership. Currency, seen as a symbol of capitalism and individualism, was abolished. Banknotes were burned and currency was eliminated. The entire economy was remade in Pol Pot's image, with agriculture as its singular focus. There were no shops, no buying, and no selling. Basic resources were distributed by the state, or often withheld as a form of control. The Khmer Rouge pushed this new economic model by organizing Cambodia into cooperatives and labor camps, forcing people into communes where they would live and work together under the direct control of the state. Families were often split up, as men and women were assigned to different labor units, while children were separated and indoctrinated into the regime's ideology. In Pol Pot's world, traditional family bonds were considered a threat to loyalty toward the state. The family unit, along with religious and cultural practices, was dissolved. People were expected to give their allegiance solely to the Khmer Rouge. Daily life in these cooperatives was grueling. People labored from dawn until dusk, often working under harsh conditions with barely enough food to sustain them. Farmers were expected to produce enormous quotas of rice, far beyond what was realistically possible. Yet, the regime demanded relentless productivity, often resulting in exhaustion, injury, and death from overwork. The workers were allowed minimal rations, typically a small serving of watery rice porridge each day. Malnutrition and starvation were common, but the Khmer Rouge had little tolerance for complaints. Those who could not work or who were accused of laziness were labeled as enemies of the revolution, and often executed or sent to punishment camps. Education, too, was viewed with suspicion. Schools were closed, books were destroyed, and those who were literate or had formal education were seen as a potential threat. Teachers, scholars, and even students were considered dangerous, carriers of the old corrupt ways that the Khmer Rouge sought to erase. Intellectuals were one of the first groups targeted for execution, and the fear of being seen as educated became so profound that people would destroy their own books, lie about their pasts, and avoid any behavior that might suggest intellectualism. In democratic Kampuchea, even something as small as wearing glasses could be grounds for suspicion and death. Cultural erasure extended beyond education. The Khmer Rouge systematically targeted Cambodia's rich spiritual and cultural heritage. Buddhism, the nation's predominant religion, was banned, and temples were destroyed or converted into warehouses and prisons. Monks were forced into hard labor, and many were executed. Traditional Cambodian music, dance, and art were forbidden, and any expression of the country's historical identity was silenced. To Pol Pot, the only identity that mattered was the new collective identity he was imposing. The forced displacement of people from cities, combined with brutal agricultural policies and inadequate food supplies, led to a catastrophic famine. Starvation was widespread, as even the rice grown under harsh quotas was frequently confiscated by the regime. By 1976, starvation and disease were rampant in many areas. The weak and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, as were children, who suffered from malnutrition on a massive scale. The death toll from starvation alone reached hundreds of thousands, and for those living in remote labor camps, the situation was even more dire. With little to no access to medical care and a diet that was often insufficient to sustain them, people perished by the thousands. But starvation and disease were not the only killers in democratic Kampuchea. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge viewed certain segments of the population as inherently dangerous and conducted systematic purges to eliminate them. The infamous killing fields became the final destination for hundreds of thousands of Cambodians. These were mass execution sites scattered across the countryside, where prisoners were taken under the cover of darkness, often bound and blindfolded to be murdered. The methods of execution were brutal. To save ammunition, the Khmer Rouge often used tools like shovels, hoes, and bamboo sticks to kill prisoners. The remains were buried in shallow mass graves, many of which were left unmarked, One of the most notorious symbols of this systematic murder was Tuol Sleng, or S-21, a former school turned into a high-security prison and torture center. At S-21, those suspected of opposing the regime, including intellectuals, professionals, and even former Khmer Rouge soldiers, were interrogated, tortured, and ultimately killed. Of the estimated 20,000 people who entered Tuol Sleng, only a handful survived. The prison became a stark representation of the regime's cruelty, a place where humanity was systematically erased, one person at a time. The combined effects of forced labor, starvation, disease, and the purges led to one of the most devastating genocides in modern history. In less than 4 years, the Khmer Rouge was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population. Entire families, communities, and generations were wiped out. Pol Pot's regime succeeded in transforming Cambodia, but the vision he imposed was one of darkness and destruction, a nightmare masquerading as a revolutionary society. As the years passed, the once tightly controlled system began to falter. Resistance started to grow, and cracks appeared within the Khmer Rouge itself. But by the time this brutal regime began to lose its grip, the damage had been done. Pol Pot's vision of Year Zero had left Cambodia in ruins, its people broken and traumatized. The killing fields remained, silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded under the Khmer Rouge, symbols of a nightmare that would haunt Cambodia for generations. The Khmer Rouge's rule under Pol Pot was rooted not only in the concept of Year Zero and a relentless push for agrarian collectivism, but also in a deep culture of terror. Pol Pot's strategy relied on instilling absolute fear across every level of Cambodian society, ensuring total submission to his vision and eradicating any opposition, real or imagined. Fear was used as a weapon to maintain control, silence dissent, and enforce obedience to the Khmer Rouge's demands, no matter how brutal. To create this culture of terror, Pol Pot employed tactics that included an extensive network of torture centers, the most notorious being Tuol Sleng, or S-21, a high-security prison in Phnom Penh. Originally a high school, Tuol Sleng was transformed into a site of horror under the Khmer Rouge. Here, those accused of undermining the regime were brought for interrogation, a process that was nothing short of merciless torture. The majority of prisoners in Tuol Sleng were intellectuals, former government officials, and, chillingly, Khmer Rouge members themselves. Pol Pot's paranoia had grown so extreme that he feared even his most loyal followers could turn against him. The Khmer Rouge began purging its own ranks, suspecting individuals of counter-revolutionary activity. In this atmosphere, loyalty was a fragile thing. Even a single misstep or the wrong association could lead to imprisonment, torture, and death. Once inside Tuol Sleng, prisoners faced relentless abuse. Torture methods varied, from severe beatings to electric shocks and waterboarding, all intended to break the prisoners' spirits and extract confessions, no matter how false or absurd. Individuals were often forced to confess to fabricated crimes such as espionage, treason, or anti-state plotting. The goal was to secure a confession that justified their execution and further fed the regime's paranoia by exposing more so-called traitors. The torture process was systematic, conducted by young, low-level Khmer Rouge soldiers who themselves had been indoctrinated to view all enemies of the regime with utmost suspicion and cruelty. The guards at Tuol Sleng, many of whom were mere teenagers, carried out their duties with a zealousness born from fear and conditioning. This was the regime's calculated approach. They deliberately placed the enforcement of these policies in the hands of young Cambodians, many of whom were orphaned or indoctrinated, with no ties to the previous Cambodian society and no framework for empathy. Once confessions were obtained, prisoners were usually sentenced to execution. They were taken to the killing fields, open-air sites across Cambodia where mass executions were carried out. Here, the Khmer Rouge preferred low-cost methods of killing to save on ammunition. Victims were often bludgeoned with farming tools or suffocated with plastic bags before being pushed into mass graves. Even in death, the Khmer Rouge sought to strip individuals of dignity and identity. Tuol Sleng is a potent example of the sheer paranoia that permeated the Khmer Rouge regime. Over the course of its operation, an estimated 20,000 people passed through Tuol Sleng's gates, but only a handful survived. The walls were covered with mugshots of prisoners taken before they faced their torturers, a haunting reminder of the many lives lost within its walls. Each face, frozen in a moment of forced compliance or silent terror, represented the ruthless efficiency of a regime that had turned on its own people. The Khmer Rouge's culture of terror extended well beyond torture centers. In everyday life, people were encouraged to report any signs of disloyalty among their neighbors, friends, or even family members. Everyone was suspect, and a culture of mistrust and betrayal took root across the country. Parents were often turned against their children, siblings against siblings, as fear eroded the very fabric of society. People became adept at masking their thoughts, hiding any potential sign of resistance, knowing that a single comment or association could be enough to condemn them. The Khmer Rouge's persecution of intellectuals and professionals was another tragic chapter in this reign of terror. Pol Pot viewed the educated class with deep suspicion, fearing that intellectuals could foster dissent against his vision of a new Cambodia. Teachers, doctors, engineers, and former government officials were hunted down, labeled as traitors, and either executed or sent to labor camps. Books were burned, schools were closed, and any symbol of intellectual life was dismantled. The very existence of educated individuals was seen as an ideological threat, and to survive, many people destroyed any evidence of their education, even going so far as to pretend they could not read or write. Paranoia ran so deep that even the Khmer Rouge's own leaders were not immune. Pol Pot launched multiple purges within his inner circle, often accusing his most loyal comrades of conspiring against him. No one was safe. Members of the party who had been with Pol Pot since the beginning found themselves on the wrong side of his suspicions. This climate of fear within the party became a self-reinforcing cycle as leaders betrayed one another to avoid accusations or eliminate rivals, further isolating Pol Pot and consolidating his grip on power. The fear that he had sown across the country now extended to his own movement, hollowing it out from the inside. The paranoia that ruled the Khmer Rouge ultimately weakened it. As Pol Pot's suspicions grew, he alienated allies and eliminated talented, capable individuals who might have strengthened his regime. The purges decimated the ranks of the Khmer Rouge, and as internal divisions grew, the regime's unity began to crumble, setting the stage for its eventual downfall. In the end, the Khmer Rouge's rule was a case study in the destructive power of paranoia, fear, and authoritarian control. Cambodia was left scarred, its society traumatized and broken, while Pol Pot's obsession with total control created a country where silence, submission, and mistrust were the only guarantees of survival. The culture of terror he fostered left deep, lasting wounds on the Cambodian people. And even after his fall from power, the legacy of his regime's atrocities would haunt the nation for generations. By the late 1970s, the Khmer Rouge regime, with Pol Pot at its head, had pushed Cambodia to the brink of collapse. The relentless cycle of terror, mass killings, and forced collectivization had left the country reeling with millions dead and society in shambles. But it wasn't internal resistance that finally broke Pol Pot's grip on Cambodia. Ironically, the end of the Khmer Rouge's brutal reign came from beyond Cambodia's borders, ignited by tensions with neighboring Vietnam. As Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge solidified power in Cambodia in 1975, Vietnam was undergoing its own transformation following the end of the Vietnam War. North Vietnam's forces, having defeated the South, had unified the country under a communist government. Initially, the two neighboring regimes had shared ideological common ground. However, relations soured as Pol Pot's ultra-nationalist policies and territorial ambitions set Cambodia and Vietnam on a collision course. Pol Pot, deeply distrustful of Vietnam's influence, harbored aspirations of reclaiming regions that he believed historically belonged to Cambodia. particularly parts of southern Vietnam that were once within the borders of the Khmer Empire. To this end, the Khmer Rouge initiated a series of violent cross-border incursions into Vietnamese territory. These incursions, marked by indiscriminate attacks on Vietnamese villages, signaled an open hostility between the two countries. Vietnam, alarmed by the aggression and the potential for regional destabilization, began planning a full-scale response. In December 1978, after years of escalating skirmishes and border conflicts, Vietnam launched a decisive invasion of Cambodia. Armed with battle-hardened troops who had gained experience during the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese army rapidly advanced into Cambodian territory, facing little organized resistance from the Khmer Rouge forces. The Khmer Rouge, which had relied heavily on guerrilla tactics, was unprepared to defend Cambodia against a structured, well-equipped military force. In less than 2 weeks, the Vietnamese troops reached the outskirts of Phnom Penh. On January 7, 1979, Phnom Penh fell, marking the end of Khmer Rouge rule. Pol Pot and his senior commanders fled the capital, retreating into the dense jungles along the Cambodian-Thai border. From there, they attempted to maintain a hold on the region still under their influence, but the regime's centralized power had effectively collapsed. In the wake of the Vietnamese invasion, a new government, supported by Vietnam, was installed in Phnom Penh. The People's Republic of Kampuchea, led by former Khmer Rouge officials who had defected, emerged as the new face of Cambodian governance. While Vietnam initially attempted to justify its invasion as a liberation of the Cambodian people from Pol Pot's oppressive rule, the international community was not so receptive. The United Nations condemned the invasion as a violation of Cambodia's sovereignty, and Vietnam's actions triggered years of complex, contentious diplomacy. Pol Pot's influence was not immediately extinguished. The Khmer Rouge, though weakened, managed to establish a foothold in the mountainous jungle regions near the Thai border, transforming into a guerrilla resistance force. From these remote bases, Pol Pot and his loyalists continued to wage a low-level insurgency against the new government for nearly 2 decades. Though they no longer controlled Phnom Penh or the country's central regions, they sustained attacks that kept Cambodia locked in a prolonged, grinding conflict. Meanwhile, international responses to Cambodia's plight were marked by ambivalence and political maneuvering. In a surprising and controversial turn, the Khmer Rouge retained Cambodia's seat in the United Nations, largely due to Cold War dynamics and Western countries' opposition to Vietnam's influence in the region. The United States, China, and several Western allies, fearing the spread of Soviet-aligned influence in Southeast Asia, refrained from fully condemning the Khmer Rouge. This decision allowed Pol Pot's forces to receive a degree of indirect support through diplomatic recognition, despite the atrocities his regime had committed. For the Cambodian people, the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge's fall did not immediately bring relief. The new government, though nominally free from Pol Pot's rule, struggled to rebuild a society devastated by years of terror and destruction. Landmines, indiscriminately placed during years of conflict, turned vast stretches of farmland into deadly hazards, hampering agricultural recovery. Families had been shattered, communities destroyed, and many survivors were left traumatized, forced to grapple with the psychological scars left by the brutal regime. Vietnam's prolonged military presence in Cambodia, lasting until 1989, also contributed to ongoing unrest. Despite its role in ending Pol Pot's reign, the Vietnamese occupation was seen by many Cambodians as a new form of foreign domination, stirring nationalist resentment. This tension provided the Khmer Rouge with a rationale to continue their guerrilla war, capitalizing on the lingering discontent with the foreign-backed government in Phnom Penh. By the early 1990s, global dynamics began to shift. The end of the Cold War saw decreased superpower interest in Southeast Asian conflicts, creating a diplomatic opening for peace in Cambodia. International pressure mounted to bring an end to the hostilities, leading to a series of negotiations facilitated by the United Nations. In 1991, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, formally ending the Cambodian-Vietnamese conflict and initiating a framework for national reconciliation. the United Nations launched a peacekeeping mission, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, UNTAC, to oversee the country's transition to peace. As part of the peace accords, Cambodian factions, including remnants of the Khmer Rouge, agreed to disarm and participate in democratic elections. However, Pol Pot and some of his hardline followers refused to relinquish their cause and continued their insurgency, isolated but still active along the Thai border. Yet by this time, the Khmer Rouge was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal divisions and diminishing support. In 1997, the Khmer Rouge itself turned on Pol Pot. Following years of infighting, a faction within the group placed him under house arrest, publicly blaming him for the atrocities committed during his rule. This final twist marked the end of Pol Pot's influence. In April 1998, as Cambodian forces closed in on the Khmer Rouge's last remaining strongholds, Pol Pot died under mysterious circumstances, possibly from a heart attack, or some speculate, by suicide. The death of Pol Pot was the symbolic end of an era. For Cambodia, the long, slow journey toward healing and reconstruction had begun, though the country's scars remained raw. The years following Pol Pot's death saw Cambodia struggle with the legacy of the Khmer Rouge. Truth and reconciliation processes, supported by international tribunals, began the arduous task of seeking justice for the victims. Former Khmer Rouge leaders were put on trial, facing charges of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. For many Cambodians, these trials served as a painful but necessary step in acknowledging the horrors of the past and preventing their recurrence. Today, Cambodia continues to rebuild, yet the memory of Pol Pot's brutal reign lingers. The fields where countless Cambodians were killed, now called the Killing Fields, serve as a somber reminder of the depths to which the Khmer Rouge descended. The Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, once the notorious S-21 torture center, stands as a testament to the countless lives destroyed by the regime. The Khmer Rouge's rule under Pol Pot will forever remain a stark lesson in the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism, ideological extremism, and the perils of a regime that sees its own citizens as expendable. Cambodia's path to recovery has been long, its resilience a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even the darkest times. For the Cambodian people, the fall of Pol Pot was not just the end of a dictator, but the beginning of a fragile hope. A hope for peace, dignity, and a future free from the shadows of the past. After his ouster in 1979, Pol Pot faded from the center of international attention, retreating into a life marked by secrecy and isolation. He moved between remote jungles and mountainous areas near the Cambodian-Thai border, shifting his identity and hiding from global justice. Despite his fall from power, Pol Pot maintained his hold over the remaining Khmer Rouge forces, which operated as a guerrilla insurgency against the Vietnamese-backed Cambodian government throughout the 1980s. His regime had devastated Cambodia, yet the former dictator remained committed to regaining control, vowing to return and rebuild his vision for the country. With the end of the Cold War, however, the political landscape shifted, weakening the Khmer Rouge's position. Countries that had previously tolerated or indirectly supported the Khmer Rouge due to Cold War alliances grew less inclined to ignore Pol Pot's horrific crimes. In the 1990s, his world grew smaller as international pressure mounted for accountability. Khmer Rouge forces dwindled, and infighting broke out among the ranks, straining loyalties and triggering disillusionment among the group's followers. Amidst this discord, Pol Pot's iron grip on the movement weakened, and many of his former allies distanced themselves from him, recognizing the inevitable end of his influence. In 1997, a defining moment marked the beginning of Pol Pot's final downfall. Senior Khmer Rouge leaders, led by Ta Mok, also known as the Butcher for his own brutal actions, put Pol Pot on trial within the group. Once an uncontested figure of authority, Pol Pot was now at the mercy of those he had once commanded. The charges brought against him by his former comrades were rooted in anger, distrust, and a desire to sever ties with a leader whose tactics had led to countless lives lost and the disintegration of the Khmer Rouge's power. During this internal trial, Pol Pot's defense was limited to appeals to his former comrades' loyalty. Still, there was no real justice to be found in the proceeding. It was a farce, a desperate move by the remnants of the Khmer Rouge to disavow the legacy of genocide and oppression that Pol Pot represented. In the end, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, a punishment intended to pacify the mounting pressure from both within and outside the Khmer Rouge. Now the former dictator found himself under house arrest in the jungle, a shadow of the feared leader who had once controlled an entire nation. On April 15, 1998, Pol Pot died, reportedly from heart failure, though some sources speculate that he may have taken his own life. At the time of his death, he was a frail and sick man, worn down by age, illness, and isolation. His death, while marking the end of his life, did little to provide closure for the Cambodian people who had suffered under his rule. Pol Pot died without facing international justice or publicly accounting for his crimes in a formal court. The event left a haunting void for survivors, who felt that justice had eluded them once again. Yet his passing also allowed Cambodia to begin moving forward, untangling itself from his dark legacy and initiating the long, painful process of healing. With Pol Pot gone, attention turned to the other Khmer Rouge leaders who had played significant roles in the atrocities of the 1970s. The pursuit of justice faced obstacles. Khmer Rouge leaders continued to wield influence in some regions, and political complexities meant that bringing them to trial was far from straightforward. Many survivors and human rights advocates, however, were resolute in their quest to hold the regime's architects accountable, seeking not only justice but also recognition for the Cambodian genocide's immense scale and human cost. It took until 2006 for the Cambodian government, in partnership with the United Nations, to establish the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, ECCCC, commonly known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. This tribunal represented a critical step toward justice, aiming to prosecute senior Khmer Rouge officials for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Some former leaders like Nuon Chea, known as Brother Number 2, and Khieu Samphan, the former head of state, were among those who stood trial, facing charges that included the systematic extermination of ethnic and religious groups, forced labor, and the murder of political dissidents. These trials, though important, unfolded slowly. Decades had passed since the height of the Khmer Rouge's reign, and witnesses, as well as the accused, were often elderly or in poor health. Yet the trials served a crucial purpose beyond sentencing. They preserved the stories of survivors and documented the crimes of the Khmer Rouge for future generations. The proceedings allowed Cambodians and the world to hear testimonies of unspeakable suffering, ensuring that the genocide would be remembered, that the names of those lost would not be forgotten, and that Cambodia's ordeal would become part of global history. Despite the trial's imperfections and the criticisms they faced, they provided a platform for the Cambodian people to bear witness and honor the memory of their loved ones. Pol Pot's legacy remains one of brutality, ideology gone awry, and an almost inconceivable loss of human life. His vision for Cambodia, rooted in extreme agrarian socialism and fueled by paranoia, shattered families, communities, and an entire generation. The killing fields where hundreds of thousands were murdered have become a solemn symbol of the regime's terror, marking Cambodia's landscape and history with a permanent scar. The graves scattered across the country serve as painful reminders of the era when every person in Cambodia lived under the constant shadow of death. Under Pol Pot, Cambodia's educational, religious, and cultural systems were systematically dismantled. The Year Zero policy sought to erase the past and create a pure society, yet it resulted in an intellectual and cultural vacuum. Monasteries, schools, and traditional arts were destroyed. Scholars, teachers, and artists were eliminated. Decades later, Cambodia continues to rebuild its identity, reviving the cultural practices and religious beliefs that had been nearly erased by the regime. Despite the hardships, the resilience of the Cambodian people has fueled a remarkable resurgence of culture, education, and community. a testament to their enduring spirit. The psychological scars from the Khmer Rouge's rule have proven just as challenging to address as the physical rebuilding of the country. Many survivors grapple with trauma, passing down stories of survival, loss, and courage to younger generations. The Cambodian government, along with non-governmental organizations, has supported counseling programs and education initiatives, teaching future generations about the country's dark past, to help ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. The people of Cambodia have demonstrated an incredible strength in their ability to reconcile, honor, and rebuild amidst the legacy of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Pol Pot's story is a stark reminder of the capacity for human cruelty when ideology is weaponized and unchecked power is left to fester. His radical vision, unchecked by empathy or reason, serves as a warning against authoritarianism and the danger of leaders who view human life as expendable in the pursuit of their ideals. For Cambodia, his regime's collapse marked the end of a nightmare, but the path to healing has been long and complex. The resilience of the Cambodian people, their dedication to remembering the past, and their commitment to rebuilding are the enduring legacies that stand in defiance of Pol Pot's brutal vision. In reflecting on Pol Pot's life, it is essential to honor the millions who lost theirs under his rule. Cambodia's story of survival, rebuilding, and remembrance serves as a testament to the human spirit's resilience, a light that continues to shine in the wake of unimaginable darkness. The killing fields, Tuol Sleng, and the trials of Khmer Rouge leaders serve as collective reminders that history must be remembered, lest it be repeated. Pol Pot's impact on Cambodia will never be forgotten, but the strength and courage of those who survived stand as an unbreakable legacy that transcends his destructive rule. Today, Cambodia stands as a country in recovery, yet deeply marked by the horrors of the Khmer Rouge era. The collective memory of the Khmer Rouge's brutal reign is woven into the national psyche, shaping the ways Cambodians live, remember, and relate to their history. For many, the killing fields are not just historic sites, but reminders of personal loss. Families who survived recall the trauma of forced labor, starvation, and the constant fear of execution. Survivors have shared their stories, many now documented in memoirs and testimonies that give voice to those silenced during Pol Pot's reign. Cambodians who were too young to remember firsthand hear these stories from elders who lived through the atrocities, ensuring that these memories are passed down through generations. The killing fields themselves have become sites of mourning and reflection, with memorials established where so many lost their lives. Perhaps the most haunting symbol is the stupa at Choeung Ek, filled with thousands of skulls unearthed from the surrounding fields. It is a somber space for Cambodians and visitors alike, a visual reminder of the scale of loss and the depths of suffering endured. These sites have become places where the country confronts the past and acknowledges its enduring pain, offering both a space for personal grief and a commitment to ensuring history does not repeat itself. The international community has played a significant role in documenting and memorializing the genocide, bringing global awareness to the atrocities committed under Pol Pot's rule. The establishment of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, a hybrid tribunal supported by the United Nations, was a landmark effort to bring some of the Khmer Rouge's leaders to justice. The trials were fraught with logistical, financial, and political challenges, and for some Cambodians, justice came far too late. However, the trials were an essential step in publicly acknowledging the Khmer Rouge's crimes, and they offered survivors the chance to see some accountability, even if limited. Global organizations and advocates continue to support education about the genocide, and they work with Cambodian educators and museums to integrate the lessons of this dark chapter into both national and international consciousness. Through programs and partnerships, Cambodia's story is told around the world, from museums and exhibitions to educational initiatives that teach young people about the dangers of extremist ideologies. These efforts emphasize not only the importance of remembering the victims, but also the need for vigilance against forces that promote dehumanization and division. For the world, the legacy of the Khmer Rouge era serves as a grave reminder of what can happen when power is unchecked, when ideology is weaponized against the very people it claims to help, and when fear replaces compassion in governance. The lessons from Pol Pot's regime resonate beyond Cambodia's borders: the importance of upholding human rights, protecting vulnerable populations, and fostering open societies where voices of dissent are heard, not silenced. The Khmer Rouge's impact is a profound reminder that atrocities of such scale are not confined to history textbooks. They are warnings, etched into human history, of the need to prevent future tragedies. As Cambodia continues to rebuild, the resilience and courage of its people stand testament to a nation that has faced unimaginable adversity. Today, Cambodian communities worldwide and international allies honor the memory of those lost by working toward a world where compassion and humanity triumph over oppression. While the scars of the Khmer Rouge era will remain, Cambodia's journey forward is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring will to build peace from the rubble of destruction. Thank you for watching and reflecting with us on this profound chapter in human history. We hope you'll join us again here on Bio Bytes as we explore the resilience, recovery, and remembrance that keep history's lessons alive for generations to come. Remember to subscribe and stay with us for more deep dives into stories that reveal the power and resilience of humanity.